Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? The highly anticipated testimony of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is underway. Today, we'll examine RFK Jr.'s cult leader-like status, how he tapped into deep frustrations in this country and earned the adoration, zeal, and reverence of a movement, uniting MAGA with the far left under the banner of Make America Healthy Again. How did a prominent vaccine skeptic ascend to a confirmation hearing for one of the most important positions in government, in charge of a $1.7 trillion budget and the regulation and safety of vaccines in our food supply? We'll unpack the emotion and fear right now inside the halls of public health as scientists tell us they feel gut-punched and scared that their research, academic freedom, and ability to improve the health and safety of Americans is now on the line. And we'll hear from those giddy with excitement at the possibility of Bobby, as they call him, becoming the nation's next chief health secretary. A lot to get to today, so let's get started. Okay, everybody, welcome to Why Should I Trust You? I'm Brenda Adhikari.
I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
I'm Mark Abdamalik.
I want to introduce a special guest we have today. Say hi to Travis Tripodi, everybody.
Yay.
Hey,
Welcome,
Travis.
Travis comes to us as another friend from Braver Angels. Travis works as an independent consultant, mostly supporting the health technology industry, which is pretty relevant to our conversation today, I'd say. And he says he's someone who lost some trust in the medical establishment following COVID. We met a couple months ago, I want to say, right, Travis?
Yeah, I think back in November. Maybe.
Yeah, we had a really good conversation back then, and we wanted Travis to join us because there's a lot going on with the RFK Jr. hearings, and we wanted to have a nice, good, spicy chat about that. A little bit later, we're going to be speaking with Katelyn Jetelina. In fact, we talked to her earlier already, so that conversation was a really good one. Katelyn is an epidemiologist as well as the author of a really popular substack called Local Epidemiologist. We talked to her about some of these kind of 11th hour directives that came out of the Trump administration involving grants and loans that have been put on freezes on announcements and external communications. And we just want to unpack that because it seems like public health is in a bit of a tizzy over all that. So we want to just figure out what's going on. But we want to chat about all things RFK Jr. So guys, what are you hearing right now? What's on your mind? Tom, what do you...
I'm like not even paying attention to you because I'm watching the hearing.
It's pretty juicy.
It's must see.
Yeah.
Just like all those other HHS confirmation hearings.
No, I think that this is a first, right?
Well,
I mean, can anyone even remember? Can anyone like Alex Azar, Javier Becerra, Kathleen Sebelius? Did anyone watch those hearings ever?
I remember you and I pre-partied for the Sebelius one, but
totally.
I don't actually remember.
We raged.
Yeah.
I mean, in case you didn't know it was going to be on, I mean, if you turned on your TV last night, there were like political ads about this hearing.
Yeah.
I mean, in states across the country. I mean, there's not even an election. Nobody's going to a voting booth, but there are ads about
it feels like
hearing.
an election. You're right. It does. Hey, Travis, tell us. So have you been watching any of it?
I watched the first 2 hours of it, and I'd say I hope that the Department of Government Efficiency can do something about these Senate hearings because they're really mind-numbing. So
there you go.
You're like, first item for Doge is
everybody can agree on that.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're kind of joking here about the fact that we typically don't really talk about the nominations for, the Department of Health and Human Services and the secretary for that. But the reason we are is not only is it because it's Bobby Kennedy and he's a Kennedy and for all the baggage that comes with that, but really, I think what's interesting is this is, it feels like a political realignment is happening in this country in some ways. And MAHA, this Make America Healthy Again movement, is ascendant. It is here. I mean, I got to tell you, the number of text messages I've gotten from Kennedy supporters over the last 48 hours is, the things they say about this man, it feels like he's like a god to them or something.
Yeah, it feels like it's Trumpian. Trump's the Big Dipper, or maybe RFK is the Little Dipper. I mean, he is no, he's got that quality. It's like a combination of, like you used the phrase in the intro, like cult leader like status. I mean, people love him, and it crosses from far left crunchy to far right MAGA. A lot of people believe him, and it's it's surreal to watch this because here you have Republicans, sitting here supporting and throwing softballs to a guy who, is a lifelong Democrat, son of the Kennedy family, an environmentalist, a lawyer who sues big industry. It's wild. And at the same time, you've got Democrats who are railing against him, obviously for vaccines, but on a lot of the other things he's talking about, chronic health and the food industry and big business and America getting sicker and sicker and sicker, and the need for more regulation of those things. A lot of those Democrats have been saying that for years. So I think one senator said it's like we've really gone through the looking glass here, and it really is something to watch this hearing.
Brenda, you said your phone is blowing up with people who support it. I mean, as a doctor, my phone is blowing up. I mean, the prospect of him being the head of HHS has has rattled a lot of the healthcare community. I mean, that's putting it mildly. I mean, his views, they don't exactly line up with evidence-based medicine on so many things. And, we've been talking about how bad trust in healthcare already is. And, there's been so many things that have allowed it to break down. But honestly, I don't even think we really can grasp or have grasped yet what a total lack of trust from some in the medical community could look like if now RFK Jr. is the one steering the ship. These doctors are just unsure about what to do when there is this undertone of, questioning so many things. I mean, I don't know how many times vaccines came up, just vaccines alone.
Yeah. Travis, what do you think is behind this force that is the Make America Healthy Again movement that is making Robert F. Kennedy Jr. represent something, it seems to this group, so much bigger than just health secretary?
He was the first person to start talking about the public health crisis, there's the health crisis generally in this country in a way that brought it to the public stage, that got it into a major party platform, and to have us actually start being able to take public resources and dedicate them towards it. And I think that when somebody does that, particularly somebody like a Kennedy, who's been taking on the administrative state in lots of different ways and putting himself personally at risk, somebody who's had an uncle and a father assassinated and has been under intense security concerns for the past several years, to do that all at personal risk and all doesn't need to do this. I think you get this. That's where you get this cult following from. People have this really strong emotional reaction about somebody. It's just very American. He just embodies what it means to be an American to somebody like me. To kind of put their country first and just again a great personal risk. And so that would be my perspective of kind of where some of that sentiment is coming from.
It clearly seems like he is a product of that breakdown in trust. I think where the Democrats in that hearing room are attacking is he's also a cause of that trust breakdown by questioning, settled science. Things like vaccines don't cause autism. To the vast majority of science that has been litigated, researched, chased, tested, and proven that vaccines do not, in fact, cause autism. There's obviously parts that excite you about RFK and sort of going in and trying to, as much as the head of HHS can, turn the ship around and aim it towards these chronic health issues. Are there parts of RFK that worry you?
That's a good question. I wouldn't say that there's any more that worries me about RFK than worries me about myself and my own level of skepticism, whereas it can be a kind of chaotic, there's an uncertainty about questioning, questioning institutions, really digging down. And I kind of push back a little bit on this idea that his views are contradictory to evidence-based medicine. Everything I've ever heard him say has been that he supports evidence-based medicine and that he doesn't think that we're doing it right now. And so I think, from my perspective, there is, when you start to tear away at the fabric of our institutions, there's chaos that comes with that and uncertainty, and we're going to make errors. And so that concerns me. There are going to be errors that occur, and it could potentially cause harm. But I believe very strongly that it's we need to do this, because I think that we do have corrupt institutions. I think our scientific system, whatever that is heavily funded by a government, which I don't think should be the case. And it has created a kind of like a dogma in the scientific community that's kind of shifted away from evidence-based medicine. And so anyways, I would say, like, I don't know the man. But from what I've seen, I've listened to hundreds of hours of him speaking. That's not an exaggeration. I listened to everything he did for the past 2 years. I had Kennedy signs in my yard until November, even after he went and decided to support Trump. And I think that...
I didn't know that, Travis.
Yeah, one of the reasons why is because, I believe in how genuine he is and how much he cares, about coming to the correct answers for things and not thinking dogmatically. And that's something we haven't heard in government and from politicians in a very long time.
I just want to push you just a little bit, because I think there's a lot of, at least the Democrats were trying to draw out some inconsistencies. Today, he says he supports vaccines. There was a lot of pushback against him on, his longstanding pro-choice views. And I think the feeling was, you used the word dogma, is he now having to shapeshift and to profess allegiance to the dogma of Donald Trump, who has, placed him in this opportunity to have this job? Do you feel the RFK that you've listened to for hundreds of hours is the same RFK that you're seeing today in the hearing, in the run-up to the hearing, on some key issues such as vaccines, such as abortion rights?
Without answering too quickly, like, absolutely. I've heard him say all of these things before exactly the same way. RFK does one of these things. He talks so much that he definitely, and he's a lawyer, so I think he memorizes his arguments. And so, like, I've heard him literally say it with the same, like, style of all the things that he's saying, almost the exact same words. And you can question whether or not that's not genuine, or whatever. But I think that it's very in keeping with everything that he said. I think if you, like, obviously, like, I don't think that it's incongruous to be pro-choice and also, like, think it's a tragedy to have when any abortion happens. I think that something I've learned from my work with Braver Angels, which, for the listeners who don't know, is a organization that works on depolarizing politics in the U.S. through conversations, mostly between the two sides. And one of the things that I've learned through that is sometimes you need to change how you talk about things to better communicate to the other side and to appeal to their moral framework, not so as to, like, get a different result, but so that they really get what's in your heart better. And I think that that's what RFK is doing on the abortion topic. And on the vaccine topic, I will say, like, my perspective, that everything that's said about him on being anti-vaccine is pharmaceutical propaganda. I've heard him talk so much about how he's not anti-vaccine. Just one thing to think about is that I think you can be skeptical of a portion of vaccines without being skeptical of all vaccines. That's true without the COVID vaccine in the picture at all. And I think it's really this nuance that's why I say propaganda. It's being, like, very specifically ignored. The nuance is being specifically ignored to make a political point.
So as a scientist, as a virologist, it's so helpful to get to hear your perspective and what people think. One of the things that struck me while RFK Jr. was talking in the confirmation hearings was that he did address that on the podcast where he said no vaccine is safe or effective, that he had maybe also said that he thought live virus vaccines were the most safe or effective. And that was curious to me because, like, when you look at the safety of different vaccine types, that's the least safe of the different types. And so I guess because he's coming at it, an environmental lawyer, he doesn't have the expertise of somebody who's been in research science or a physician. How does his background play into how you perceive him leading something like this big juggernaut of human and health services?
I would say that I'm not somebody that's, like, hyper focused on credentialism. I don't put very much weight in that, so it doesn't bother me at all that he's coming at this as a lawyer who's litigated a lot of these particular issues. I think he mentioned that he's been issuing lawsuits and litigating lawsuits against these particular agencies now that he's now being asked to lead for years now. And his big, the thing he says that when you do that, you get this like PhD in how these operations work. And I would say that it depends on your perspective. I'm not an expert on all the specific scientific literature on the safety and efficacy of vaccines, so I can't say whether or not he's right. I can say that I trust that he means it when he says he wants to know for sure, and he wants to commission the studies from NIH that actually investigate these things, and he wants to dissolve the corporate capture that the pharmaceutical company has over these agencies. I think two things can be true at the same time. There can be all the great people that are thinking about public health in these agencies that you referenced, but there can also be a certain amount of corporate capture that needs to be rooted out, and somebody needs to take it seriously.
You trust him enough, and you trust his judgment enough.
I trust that he believes in the same kind of philosophy that I believe in, which is like the role of government should be smaller, and we should be held accountable. It should be transparent, and I believe that he believes in the scientific method, not like this is true because somebody with a PhD said it was true, which is how my perspective of how a lot of scientific discussions have gone over the past couple of years. But like genuinely like looking, like following the scientific method of saying, like, proposing a hypothesis and then doing everything you can to try and nullify that hypothesis, and then coming out on the end of like, this is what, now we know truth at the end of this. I believe that he thinks those things. I think he is very conscious of corporate capture and the excesses of government. And he's going, so those are where my areas of trust come from.
What you're talking a lot about, or a theme I'm hearing, is like his intent. You seem to buy into his intent that he wants to make America healthy again. He wants to fight off chronic diseases. He's genuinely, interested in these things. And I know there's a lot of criticism about how we got here over the past few years. One of the things, that I wonder is, do you take that same lens and do you give the same grace and room for the public health leaders that you've, heard about over the past 4 years? Do you give that same grace to the other side, where it may be hard for them to have made decisions? They didn't have all the data. They didn't have all the information. How much of that leeway do you give them? And are you doing it the same that you're giving RFK Jr.?
That is a really good question. I would say that I give them the leeway that the situation they were in was very hard. I do think that that's true. And from a human perspective, I think people made really difficult decisions, like say from 2020, until 2022, that like, or three or whatever, that just like they never ever experienced before, like coming up and having to like make those decisions. I think about trust and how I decide to trust people based off of, I can't remember, I think it's Stephen Covey that wrote this book. It's about two pillars. One is competence and one is integrity. And I choose not to question the integrity of people like Francis Collins and the people in the public health agencies, like Dr. Fauci or whoever that were making these decisions. But there's a real question of competence and like the actual results of what happened during that time. And so I would say that from a, like, if I'm building up those two pillars, like for RFK, they both exist. I trust in his integrity. I trust in his competence. And I'm not going to say that I definitely trust the integrity of everybody in the public health establishment, but I will say that for sure, there's a crumbled pillar on the competence side. And I don't know if that answers your question, but like, that's how I'm thinking about it.
I mean, it does. But some of what RFK wrote in his book, he talks about that the choices that were made were intentional, that there was a grand scheme to overthrow democracy and control the population. And I think that's what generates a lot of frustration with the viewpoint that, there was incompetence and there was, a complete dropping of the ball. And that does fuel like more frustration and distrust when you start to question this kind of integrity, which you said, you don't like to do.
Things can be true. Two things can be true. Most people in public health can have integrity and be wanting to do the right thing. And the incentive structures that exist in our government and in our politics can create opportunities for us, like a very small group of people that have negative intent to take advantage of those things.
How do you think he was doing today in the hearing that we didn't get to see all of it? It's still going on, but what were your impressions?
I think he was doing great. I think he's going to get this job. And, you know, and the reason I think that is because it's just the nature, partly politically, of how the nomination system is going. Like, I just don't see a world in which, like, Pete Hegseth gets nominated and RFK Jr. doesn't. So I could be eating crow, but it just feels like it's going that route. With that said, right, like, assuming the guy goes through, I think, Travis, you know, what he's going to have to contend with is the fact that when you are somebody who's been a public figure for as long as he's been, when you're a fucking Kennedy, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's just this record out there of every single thing you've ever said about anything. And so I appreciate what you're saying, that you think it's propaganda, his views on vaccines, but a lot of these are just words that he himself has written on paper, you know, contesting germ theory, saying polio virus doesn't cause polio, and all these other kind of things that have been disputed by science. Now he's going to have to also earn the trust of many people out there in mainstream science who are really concerned about his seeming lack of respect for some of the most basic principles that have been undisputed up until recently by him. I think that's doable because fundamentally, like, I want the guy to succeed. I believe that chronic health is a fucking, like, crisis in this country. It's ridiculous to me that 70% of this country, like, qualifies as overweight or obese, and that nearly 40% of children are pre-diabetic. Like, that's heartbreaking to me, you know? He's gotta also realize that he can't be dug in on things that maybe he's held true. And actually, what I'm hearing him say in this hearing makes me think he cares enough about chronic disease that he's not necessarily, and I know I'm going against what Dr. Paul Offit said, who I think believes that he is a zealot, who believes Kennedy's a zealot, who's going to be literally making it his job to undermine vaccine uptake in this country. I don't know. All I know is that he's going to have to work really hard to also work with this other group that is now really mistrustful of him.
We've said chronic disease here like 5 times at least, and it's almost like it's a new buzzword. I mean, in medicine, we've used that phrase for many, many years. I mean, RFK is making a big deal about chronic disease, but that's something doctors have been battling for decades. I mean, we have constantly, at every visit when you go, talked about the link between, you know, our lifestyle and chronic disease. I mean, look around. I mean, it is a ubiquitous topic. I mean, he is not making a revelation. I mean, this is just an obvious reality. And I think he's seizing a moment. I mean, people are so frustrated with their health, with their health care. And this is, you know, an easy thing because it's something that is rallying support.
I know you're saying that public health has talked about chronic health for years and the chronic disease epidemic, but the Make America Healthy Again movement is revolutionary. And I think that what they have done, whether you agree with them or not, whether you agree that they peddle in conspiracy theories or not, they have effectively taken what are like crunchy moms with the MAGA right, and they figured out how to bring those two groups together under a platform of health and under a platform of things that have typically been associated with liberal Democrats when it comes to things like holding pharmaceutical companies accountable, getting toxins out of food, eating organic, you know, like exercise, things like that. And I just, you know, there's like, I don't think we can underestimate that.
The problem, I think, is that people assume that doctors don't want to be and public health scientists don't want to be in the Make America Healthy Again movement. We were the first to line up for that movement. Okay. That's the difference. I think that it's a little bit of gaslighting when you say that, oh, this is now finally something that we want to talk about. Again, it's been talked about. Look, nothing has been perfectly executed. And I think if there's a belief that we're suddenly going to perfectly execute on Make America Healthy Again, we're all going to have our foot in our mouth. It is something that we've all been talked about. And you know what? It's great. Let us all rally around, let's make America healthy again. But the path
and Michelle Obama, when she tried to do similar things, was obstructed and I don't really understand why, because she was also trying to fight chronic disease. And I'm kind of curious about
Look,
that.
it's not sexy. It's not sexy to talk about chronic disease, right? It's not the easy win.
It is
right?
now.
The easy win is let me give you a pill, right? And then the pharma companies make a lot of money on that. But, the first treatment for so many diseases is to talk about lifestyle. It's just not sexy. It's not making headlines. Maybe now it is with social media because there's different yoga mats and different Pilates classes you can take and different supplements that you can take, which none of them are regulated. And we need to talk about that later. But if you want to, let's talk about making chronic diseases a sexy topic. Great. We're all right there for you.
Maggie, I got to ask you, talk to me about the day after, right? Like, are public health and science talking about the fact that if he goes through, he is going to be in charge of, the agency that disperses grants. He's going to be in charge of really everything involving health in this country. And how are you going to work with him? When does it shift from fighting to resist his nomination to, all right, he's our guy, we got to work with him? And like, how are you guys going to do that?
Oof, big question, Brenda. I don't know that I can.
And you represent all of public health. Go.
I certainly don't. But as my opinion, I think the day after is, it's a little up in the air. I don't know if he'll be confirmed or not. I know as somebody who works in a lab and is trying to understand, these mechanisms of chronic diseases caused by viral illnesses, that I'll continue to do that. It's fascinating because there's, we have this hold right now, which has impacted things like PEPFAR, which is incredibly important to our response to HIV globally. That is halted because we have, and that comes from the administration currently, not RFK Jr. So I would like to see things like that immediately be allowed to move forward that are going to.
John Cornyn in the hearing today praised PEPFAR and RFK did too, and they pledged to work together to expand it and grow it.
And I would love to see that. I wonder, Travis, I'm just so fascinated with your perspective on how science can enhance transparency. How can these agencies earn your trust again, like to the same level as maybe what you have for RFK Jr. Or what do you expect or hope to see?
I think that we need to have a conversation about the role of government and like what it should be doing. And I'm sorry if I'm not going to answer your question exactly, but as I'm hearing you talk about this PEPFAR or whatever it is, this idea that like the US taxpayer, and I'm not talking about people that are doing well. We're talking about people like on the margin that, they're deciding, if they can't buy organic meat because they can't afford to buy organic meat at the grocery store. A portion of the money that they're like that they would have available to spend on that organic meat is going to fight an HIV crisis in Africa.
And I in just the US, it's globally. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it is.
But I don't know exactly why our responsibility as taxpayers is to solve every problem in the world globally. That's certainly true from like a public health perspective, and I can understand like a moral and from a compassion perspective, like the desire to do something like that. But I think that one of the things that's worth questioning, when it comes to the size and scope of HHS, the funding of this research, it goes all the way down from like, are we funding these things in Africa to what are we funding in terms of research here in this country? Why does that need to come from taxpayer dollars? Why does it need to come from the federal government, from the executive branch, from the most centralized, most corruptible branch of government? Why does all that money have to go all the way to the top and then come all the way down? And I think and sorry, I know that probably didn't really answer your question, but that's like what I'm thinking about as I'm.
Well, also,
I want to know all your thoughts.
And you, I think, to be fair, you are a classic libertarian. I think for you, it is that the market decides, the solutions to a lot of society's ills, and that is maybe a more fundamental break in terms of. And look, you're about to have this guy that you really like is about to be the head of the biggest government agency, and you may even break with him in terms of like he supports PEPFAR, he supports Medicaid and Medicare, he supports a lot of these organizations and these groups that from the very top of the government provide aid for the whole country. And you may break with him from a values perspective. But I think, going back to this chronic disease, like this vision, he's even saying, and I've read this in places, that he and some of his cohort believes that even the number of people in government is linked to chronic disease. Because if the chronic disease epidemic were resolved, we wouldn't need quite as many people in HHS to have to fight illness. Like I'm just saying that's how deep the chronic disease ethos goes for him. Like it goes straight through his vision of how to staff HHS. You know what I'm saying? Now that RFK is potentially going to be the head of HHS, is that what's really for you going to be like, okay, so if there is another pandemic and he's the guy, I'm going to be more inclined to listen to him because he's now in charge.
I think the transparency is going to go a long way to rebuilding trust. I'm optimistic that I would be very shocked if an HHS under RFK Jr. wasn't radically transparent, as he's promised several times today. And I think, just things like again, when I focus on the shift towards dogma that I've kind of alluded to, is there are things that a lot of people have suggested. Like the use cases for ivermectin is just like a really common example, and I think a lot of people want to see studies commissioned to see what the use cases for ivermectin are, and to prove. And if they come out and they show that the conspiracy theorists are all wrong, then that's what's going to do for me is give me trust that it's
but you
not
don't
just
feel that's been proven. You need him to go into the building, come out with the research and say, okay, now it's proven, right?
Because that study came out. It was
and
we actually did an episode about it with the guy who sort of did and Mark, I want you to talk a little more about it, but it was like the biggest study done on ivermectin. It came out conclusively to say that it has no impact on the cure or treatment of COVID.
We've looked at it exhaustively according to the science protocols that we have. I guess my question is, do you not trust that was done in a way that's comprehensive enough?
Like you need him there to say,
no,
I got you. This study's good or this study's bad, right? I mean, that
helps.
Link?
That certainly helps because there's somebody I trust that's telling me that. But that's not. I wouldn't say that. I would say I don't know the details of the study, the ivermectin study. I know for a particular example, because this was in the Real Anthony Fauci, and I did read that book. I think it was about the hydroxychloroquine study that they came out, and then everybody cited as saying that that hydroxychloroquine did not help COVID, or did not protect or prevent anything from COVID. Well, if you look at the actual study methodology, the amounts that they were giving people were not clinical, they were not sufficient, right? So there are things that get obfuscated in the clinical methodology that are not communicated appropriately to the public. The actual methodology of the vaccine trials are really relevant. What about the differences in age ranges, or that was
I mean, you're talking about the scientific method. You're embracing the scientific method right there, right? What was the right dose? But the studies for hydroxychloroquine were done, that it did have an emergency use authorization. But I think what we're hitting on is something really important. When public health gets tangled in politics, we end up in a bind. And I think that's where we're stuck right now. Important decisions that start to be driven by ideology that instead of by science, when you start to just really keep questioning, well, I don't believe you did the right study, or I believe that the government shouldn't have a role in this kind of study. What is where do we find common ground that there actually is a role for government in public health? I mean, if you talked about, the taxes that we pay to fund, our scientists, well, they may be funding, therapeutics for rare diseases across the world because that's what matters. And HIV is not a rare disease, but they also fund things like, outbreaks for salmonella and the eggs that we have and the H5N1 going here. What is the role of public health in a libertarian kind of government? What's great about being a libertarian, I think, is that you have pretty clear lines, where I think a lot of people don't have clear lines. But I think most of the libertarians I know, they know their lane and they stay in it. But how do you switch lanes sometimes, especially around public health? What is the role of public health?
I consider myself a pragmatic libertarian. So, so I try not to be too ideologically driven. However, I will say that in mind, I will say that there's really no role for public health. Public health is a collectivist concept in a libertarian world.
Wait. I'm going to interrupt you.
It's about to get spicy up in here.
Travis, I have to interrupt you. So do you think there's no role for the government helping provide clarity for health issues for its citizens?
So, like I said, I consider myself a pragmatic libertarian. With the libertarian ethos, though, public health is a collectivist concept. It requires a socialist government in order to implement it. And so there is no, like, socialist, not in the sense of like communist Russia or whatever, but to a certain, like, not in keeping with the principles of individual liberty and individual ownership. And so I'm simply making the point that, like, it is a compromise. And so if you're asking, like, what as small as possible is really what I would say. The public health should be as small as possible. It's really grown out of control from my perspective. And I think that a lot of it's driven from anxiety and fear. And we saw that during COVID. It really kind of got blown out of proportion, like, in terms of the scope of that the government felt like they were responsible for closing schools or mandating masks or saying you had to be 6 feet apart in a restaurant, and then wear your mask on the way in, but you could take it off while you're sitting down. And it ends up growing out of control when you want the government to do that. So it needs to be checked very, very closely. But on the extreme, like, it's a collectivist idea. And I think that from somebody coming from my philosophy, it's not, it's a really difficult question.
If it's not the government that should be in charge of public health, in your view, who should? Like, how can we ensure good policies for health if it's not part of our governmental system?
I don't have a great answer for that, and I'm not.
Come on, Travis. I know what you're thinking about. It's at the tip of your tongue.
Well, I would say that most people are motivated to be healthy, individually, and I think they're not motivated to harm the people around them. And so if you're really going to the extremes, like, the libertarian philosophy for accounting for these things is, like, we live in the framework of a judicial system, right? You should use, like, if you cause harm through reckless behavior to people in a public health way, but in any other way as well, then you should be liable for that behavior. And I think that, ultimately that would be my preference. But again, pragmatic libertarian says, I think that probably the best way, given the what we have in front of us right now, is that we have a government. They do take on this responsibility. It probably should be as decentralized and local as possible. I don't think that it should exist at the federal level. I think there's obviously some benefits to coordination there, but I think we should really do as much to decentralize and localize it to the extent that people can hold their public health officials accountable to things that work for their communities. And so, but within the context of, like, reality, localization and decentralization is probably the best way to do it.
Yeah. What's great about this podcast is, like, we start off talking about the Kennedy hearings, and then we end up doing, like, a classical study on libertarianism. It's just great. It's just another day
and
Why
a
Should I Trust
libertarian
You?
who trusts Robert Kennedy. Someone who's made his career suing large industry for polluting water. Like, I mean that it's I find you as just, like, an optimistic person, that this changing of the guard, which we think is likely going to happen, will be for the better. And I feel like your trust that was so devastated during the pandemic may be returning. While at the same time, I think many of our listeners who trusted the establishment, scientific apparatus during the pandemic, that trust may be going out the window. So it's a crazy time.
I'm optimistic because I think, just one thing to say is, like, we've tried it one way for a very long time. Maybe let's just try it a different way for a little bit and see if that might work a little bit better. And for achieving the same goals that I think we all share, which is, a healthy population, one that isn't, like, polarized, one that is working towards ambitious goals as a country and improving prosperity for everybody.
I think one thing is without a doubt, which is that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Donald Trump built a coalition that birthed this kind of realignment that we're in right now. And in my estimation, for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to truly succeed in this position, he's going to have to keep building those coalitions. I know that he will, he wants to be in a bull in a china shop. And I think that kind of sentiment is important. Something's got to change. The status quo this country has decided does not work. And I think you're quite right about that, Travis. But at the same time, in that status quo is a lot of people who don't actually have that much power. They're just doing their jobs and they're trying to also make this country healthy again. And I think that, as much as he can, he needs to, also include people who've worked really damn hard at, different responses to some of our health ills in this country. And I hope he does that. I just want to thank you so much for joining us. We are going to definitely invite you on again. A huge thanks to Braver Angels for introducing us to people like Travis. You'll meet some others in the future. We are going to now feature a conversation we had a little bit earlier this week to another friend of the podcast, Dr. Katelyn Jetelina. She's an epidemiologist, a data scientist, the author of a wildly popular Substack newsletter called Your Local Epidemiologist, YLE for short, which she launched in the early days of the pandemic to help people understand where the science was going during the coronavirus pandemic. The reason we reached out to her was because there was all this buzz about these changes that were taking place as far as freezing communications, freezing aid, things like that. I am seeing right now, Tom, that that the Trump administration apparently has already rescinded its order to freeze federal aid funding. So look, this is clearly it's a volatile situation. Things change all the time. By the time the podcast comes out, it may change again. Really doesn't make a difference for the conversation we had with Katelyn, which we hope you enjoy. Joining us now is Katelyn Jetelina. Hi, Katelyn.
Good morning.
Good to see you. We're really excited to talk with you. Before we get into all kinds of things, you and I were texting this morning, and it seems that another directive has been issued, and this one you were saying feels like a nuclear bomb went off, you said. Tell me a little bit about what's going on.
Yes, you're not supposed to say it so dramatically, but yeah, I mean, we just get order after order after order. I mean, it's obviously the days of thunder right now. The latest order that dropped Monday night basically said in really ambiguous terms to stop all federal grants. And that is about $3 trillion by 5 p.m. on Tuesday. And with very little clarity on what that means. And I think for people that are listening, federal grants aren't just for, geeky scientists behind a lab bench. No offense, Maggie. But they're also for nonprofits. I mean, we're talking about suicide crisis line. We're talking about domestic violence shelters. We're talking about cancer survivors. And so how this plays out in the next 24 hours will be really important to watch.
This comes on the heels of that other memo from a few days ago throughout the HHS community. And, it seems like from all the reporting and from what we're hearing, there's just a lot of freaking out going on right now in public health, in sort of government-related science. How much of this do you think is sort of the natural course of a new transition, of a new administration coming in and wanting to get their arms around things? Or how much of this is the beginning of something else, something intimidating, something controlling of science itself?
I mean, I think this is the crux of the big unanswered question, right? Sure, there's transitions happen, right, every 4 or 8 years. And it's not unusual to reassess programs, shift priorities. It's not unusual either to pause communications while leaders are trying to get their footing. Health and Human Services had a pause during Biden and Obama transitions. However, the scope of this and how quickly it's happening and how dramatic and far-reaching it is absolutely unprecedented. And you're right. We don't know the motivations behind this, right? Some of these could be a sign of transition or just general lack of knowledge of what these actual agencies do from this new administration. We also have a lot of leadership gaps right now, right? But also these moves could certainly be deliberate, signaling a value shift. And I think what is incredibly unsettling is we don't know which one it is. And there's a lot of livelihoods and implications on the line for it.
Just following up from that, our show is called Why Should I Trust You? And we talk with many people who do mistrust mainstream science and public health. And, Katelyn, from their perspective, I've been texting with a bunch of folks over the last 48 hours. And, a lot of them really like these moves because they think that there needs to be some accountability for these grants and where the money is going. There needs to be accountability towards these large sort of hulking bureaucracies where they think that no one really knows the work that's going on. I mean, what do you say to folks who look at these big health institutions with skepticism and are kind of pleased that there's this accountability that's being demanded?
Yeah, I mean, just yesterday I saw a cartoon of a bull in a china shop, and people are cheering this on. And you know what? I'll be honest. I think it's okay to break things sometimes. I mean, I have been working with the CDC the past 3 years to try to get them to do better. The problem is that when you break something, you need a vision on how to rebuild it, and you need patience. And it's not clear that either of those are there. What it looks like is just total destruction, and we're going to see where the pieces fall. And given how much our safety nets and how many implications this has for being honestly dominant in the global sphere is really unsettling.
Yeah, I think, Katelyn, you've hit on a lot of really interesting points. And one of the things that, I've gotten a lot of freaked out colleagues, we've gotten a lot of messages in the department and things like that about the implications for researchers, right? And I see there are things that need to be fixed in our administrations, but in a more controlled burn way instead of a burn it all to the ground. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see this. Is it heavy-handed, or do you see this as being kind of a campaign of intimidation in science?
I mean, I think it's hard to know, right? Because it's hard to know what's actually going to be through and what are really signals of intellectual laziness, narcissism, or the currency of fear. I don't know how much these are just chess moves or they actually are going to have real long-term ripple effects. I'm trying really hard. It's almost impossible to do this, but to have a steady head, try to think of this as a marathon instead of a sprint. And see how strong our counterbalances are, right? This is a test of our checks and balances in the United States. And I guess I have no other choice but to be optimistic that Congress, that academic institutions, that private sector are going to counterbalance a lot of this executive power.
What you're saying about keeping that level head, I want to ask you about that. You are, in my estimation, one of the most effective health communicators out there. And, Miss Time Magazine voted one of the top, health communicators. I mean, that's no joke. But here's what I want to know. We have been through this before. Trump was in power before. And frankly, every president in their own way comes in with some sort of a directive or a vision of some sort, right? In this case, I think it's a very strong one in terms of what it is that he wants to get through. How do you tell people to like there are certain things to freak out about. There are other things that we got to just get ourselves together. How do you do that in an era where it feels like, people are reacting to every single thing that is put out?
I'll be honest, I've had a really hard time trying to balance that because I mean, there's really good reasons people are freaking out. I mean, literally their jobs and livelihoods are on the line, and access to services is on the line for very vulnerable people. And so I think that I think that one, you have to acknowledge that there are truly this is very scary for people. I think you have to also be very clear that there's a lot of uncertainty. There's things that we know, and there's just a lot of things that we don't know. That was a key lesson I learned during the COVID pandemic to help people weather the storm and navigate it. And something that I try to do is just bring forward authenticity and vulnerability, that I'm scared too, that we're all in it together, and to figure out how to find the North Star in this magnetic storm.
Katelyn, you mentioned something that is hitting close to home for a lot of people in the research. It's the fact that we're confused about this guidance and we're looking for clarity about how to move forward. The hearings that are coming up are about, RFK becoming the head of HHS. The memo that went out to the CDC a couple of days ago was a pause on communications, including about things like bird flu and what the rates of bird flu may be at the state level and how the federal government is maybe aggregating that data. We don't know what was going to be in that report because we never saw it. My question is, how do you see RFK handling this evolving crisis or this evolving situation with bird flu?
Bird flu is an interesting example because really the actions right now all lay around the USDA because this is more of an animal outbreak. And so we'll see what happens over on the USDA side. And of course, that's not within Kennedy's purview on the HHS. I don't know. Right now, there's a lot of being developed for next-gen vaccines for H5N1. There are vaccines in stockpile. I always get nervous when we start talking about vaccines and RFK Jr. in the same sentence. But there's going to be pressure, if not already, from the economic side around this outbreak. It is causing egg prices to just skyrocket. If you ignore it, there's going to be implications for it. And so again, I think that it'll be really interesting to see how all these counterbalances play out. But one thing is for sure, if you stop communication, the National Health Alert System in the United States, there's going to be consequences. It may not be apparent right away, but it will unfold eventually.
I mean, how do your colleagues, how does public health at large work with him on these types of things? How do you see that moving forward if he is the nominee, if he's the appointee?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what it's not. It's not screaming into the abyss and getting you're just spinning in circles. I think that what is going to happen if he gets confirmed, and even if it doesn't get confirmed with this administration, is that you have to work with them. And I know that sucks, especially since we're seen as the enemies, but that is the only way we're going to get through. And one way you work with them is framing, right? What this public health challenge is and why it's important to them, why it's America First initiative. For example, always talking about innovation, talking about biosecurity, using really key words. Also realizing that if everything's an emergency, nothing's an emergency. And we have to be very strategic on what we really hold the barricades to and what we don't. And I have not seen that strategic approach taken yet. And if it's not, our voices are going to get hoarse. And so I think that that is something I really, really want to see from public health and healthcare leadership in the United States in the weeks to come.
Katelyn, what I'm hearing you say is, scientists and mainstream public health, the establishment, however you want to refer, can't just be seen as defending itself and issuing rules and norms. It has to be seen as putting forth a vision and a positive vision for how Americans lead their lives. And for many reasons, of which you may disagree, I may agree, or whatever, many Americans feel that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Donald Trump are putting forth a vision for America when it comes to health that they can get behind. Whether it's, wanting, they've been talking a lot about chronic health, and they've been talking a lot about obesity and like chemicals and food processing. And can establishment and mainstream health put forth a similar vision on how to lead your life, as opposed to the fear of what happens if vaccines get taken away, if this gets taken away, if that gets taken away?
Yeah, I mean, it is what I'm trying to do in my newsletter, right? Is the job in public health is to equip people to make evidence-based decisions. And we have to figure out how to do that regardless of their value system or where they come from or the psychology around all of this. I think what's really hard right now, at least in public health communications, and where I'm kind of getting paralyzed even with my newsletter, is the implications are just unknown right now. I think I will say the one reason I do think this happens, this screaming from the rooftops for everything, is this cycle of panic and neglect with funding. The only way public health gets funding if there's an emergency. That's it. And so, yeah, chronic disease, we in public health have been fighting chronic disease forever. There's just never funding for it. And so if we want to get proactive, if we want to listen to the needs on the ground, we in public health have to have the ability to do that. And that has not been the case for a very, very long time. Will RFK Jr. change the landscape? Maybe, but I also think that he's going to have a very hard time reconciling his priorities with the Republican Party and lobbyists and all of that. And so, sure, he has a good message, but again, what does the implementation look like, and what is the feasibility? And does he do more harm than good when he's going forward?
Our program, Why Should I Trust You? It's sort of like our theme, our running theme. Take this moment and speak directly to the American people. Why should they trust scientists like you?
There's a reason I think that people are losing trust in institutions and scientists, is because they're not listening. And guess who is listening? The Trump administration. I don't know, this is maybe spicy, but I don't know if they should trust us. We have to show that they can trust us. And that means stepping up right now. That means having courage. That means listening. And that means helping people navigate all of this noise in real time. And if we can do that, then you build the trust. But I don't think it's, hey, I'm Dr. Katelyn Jetelina, you need to trust me. Bullshit, who are you, right? And so I
think that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hearing a lot of folks in science who are saying, for years we've either been told not to engage or that the science speaks for itself. And I sort of feel like that mentality, unfortunately, needs to go out the window right now. Science doesn't speak. Even if it does on paper, we are now in a media cycle where if you're not fighting for what you believe in, and you're not out there, and you're not everything everywhere all at once, you will not get heard.
Yeah. And we have a social media landscape that rewards emotional takes, right? So you get it's exhausting out there to read it. And I think exactly what is needed, or I'm biased, this is what I'm providing, is try to be a steady head throughout this storm and really help people think through, how does this impact my family? What do I need to do right now, today, to impact? What is the action, right? That is risk communication 101. And We'll see. I mean, we'll see if we can step up to the plate. I mean, we have to.
Katelyn, what advice do you have? How can scientists step up to the plate more?
I mean, I think this is the crux of the problem. And at least what we saw during the pandemic was scientists are not trained to speak in plain language or to the average Joe on the corner. We're very good at speaking to each other. And it is not valued in our institutions. I mean, I was going up for tenure track at University of Texas. My newsletter, which has reached 500 million people, was a bullet point under community service. Like, it's just not.
That is insane.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's no carrot, right? Or stick approach to this.
Well, it's also like a failure to understand like
Impact.
what actually works and what's making an impact right now.
Exactly.
That pisses me off.
Right. My peer-reviewed article would get maybe 10 reads in its lifetime, and one of my YLE posts get 2 million reads, right? Like the system is just too archaic to quickly adapt. And so it is up to the scientists, honestly. And a lot of people are stepping up. There's a lot of amazing voices on social media. I will be honest, though, they are doing this out of the goodness of their heart. There is no funding mechanism to support that time. Absolutely not. I am very lucky to have my newsletter be supported by the readers, but that is just not the case for a lot. And not only financial, there's also personal risks, right? People show up at my house. I mean, my husband had to put together tons of cameras around our house. And so there's a safety risk, there's a professional risk there. And you know what? I get it if it's not in people's DNA to enter the arena. But my only ask is that if people are in the arena, you support them and you recognize that they're putting their neck out there. You know, death threats suck to me. Obviously, all the FBI investigations, fine. But what actually gets me is the 1,000 paper cuts from colleagues not understanding the value of what I'm doing or how I am at least trying. And so I think that is would be my message to people. If you're not getting in the arena, then you need to at least cheer those on that are.
I'm really amped up. And I would just add, always be fighting for people. Because ultimately, what all of us got into, whatever we're doing in this world, is because we wanted to fight for people, fight for regular people. And I think that part of the issue right now is a lot of folks in mainstream science are not being seen as fighting for regular people. And I know that couldn't be further from the truth when I meet somebody like you, when I meet some other, when I meet someone like Maggie, when I meet someone like Mark, other people I know. But that is, the sense is that you are fighting for, protecting your own power, protecting your place in the hierarchy, protecting your funding, and if you think that couldn't be further from the truth, it's like, fuck, you got to get out there and say it.
Yeah, and you can't just assume that people understand. I think that's the other thing is like, you don't understand why an R01 funded grant is a bad thing. Like, no, of course they don't. Like, tell them why it matters to them. Same with a lot of this international executive orders, like pulling out of WHO. All I saw on social media and mass media quotes was people saying why this is bad for the rest of the world. That is not the message. It's why is it bad to Americans? And there's plenty of reasons for that. It's just a matter of branding or market. I don't know what you want to call it, but we have to be strategic. And I've yet to see that come to fruition, at least on a national level.
Katelyn, thank you so much for joining us. We know these are really busy times, and carving out these 40 minutes or so with us was just a real honor. And thank you for all your support of what we're trying to do with the podcast.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks, guys, for having me.
So that was Katelyn Jetelina, the author of Your Local Epidemiologist, one of our favorite substacks and a very popular health substack. She's a fantastic health communicator. Please subscribe. And please also subscribe to our podcast. Why Should I Trust You? Please rate, please review, please tell your friends, your family, everyone you know. And we will see you right back here next week.